Forward TV. The world is thinking.
It's my pleasure and honor to be here, particularly with this panel. The Logan Symposium in just the third year has really become a highlight of the American journalism calendar. It's a gathering, I think, that stands out from so many others because of the quality of the participants, the liveliness of the discussion, and the quality of the food at the evening receptions, as you'll see. I certainly would expect nothing less from a symposium that's funded in large part by the family of one Jonathan Logan, who is a fraternity brother of mine from Northwestern University, where he sacrificed his own education so that he could teach the rest of us in 3 a.m. tutoring sessions about the poetry of Howlin' Wolf and the genius of Jerry Garcia and the evils of cannabis. Little did I know that 30 years later, although he has never worked a day in an American newsroom, he would be a general in this battle to save American investigative journalism, both as a funder of Lowell's program and as the chair of the Center for Investigative Reporting. These days, there are many such generals, unlikely generals, in our midst. Allow me to share the thoughts of another, someone whose work most of you know, but in a different realm. This general's words, taken from his personal blog and edited slightly for brevity here, read, quote, "Do we really need in-depth reporting and investigative journalism? Can we manage without them? How does democracy work without in-depth news? It doesn't. While most of the population will not care about access to high-quality news, there are always some who read to find out what's really going on and why. Dictatorships, totalitarian regimes, and underdeveloped countries don't have the luxury of investigative journalism, and the news as entertainment in highly capitalist regimes isn't really informative either. It's bread and circuses. Politicians are held in check by the press, for better or worse. That, too, is one of the ways in which the press allows a democracy to function. Without the threat of public exposure, well, you can imagine. It'll be strange if the USA becomes a large industrial country with only 1 or 2 newspapers practicing in-depth coverage. What will happen when most of the country has nothing but entertainment, gossip, and sports as sources of information? It's a country ripe for takeover, if you ask me," end quote. That general in the war to save journalism, like John Logan, he's not a journalist. And like John, he's a musician, although maybe a slightly more successful one. David Byrne of Talking Heads, who clearly never stopped making sense. For the next 70 minutes or so, we're going to be talking about what we're calling domestic corruption. As we've seen over the past few years, that corruption can take a variety of forms, from the Catholic Church covering up decades of its priests abusing children, to Hall of Fame caliber baseball players enhancing their performances through the use of illegal steroids, to the mayor of Detroit using his office to build a web of deceit, cronyism, and kickbacks. In each of these cases, it was investigative journalists who brought the corruption from the darkness into the light. In fact, in those 3 cases, it was that most crippled of institutions, the American metropolitan local newspaper, that provided the essential reporting. As many of us know all too well, over the past 18 months, more than 15,000 journalists have left our profession, many of them against their will. Particularly hard hit have been local newspapers and local television stations. As someone who's had the privilege to judge several major investigative journalism contests this year, I can tell you that quality watchdog reporting on local and national issues is certainly still being conducted. But I can also tell you there's a lot less of it, and fewer stories that really stand out as extraordinary. Now, my conclusion stands in contradiction to what the Pew Research Center Projects for Excellence in Journalism found in a survey of editors. The majority of those editors insisted that their papers are doing more and better investigative reporting on a local level than ever before, but I'll be interested to hear what our panelists have to say about that. We are graced with an outstanding panel of superb investigative journalists. Each has been involved in at least one major investigation of what we're calling domestic corruption in recent years, and most have done several. For today's session, we're going to ask each of them to tell us in a little more depth about one particular investigation that they've done, the highlights of which I thought we were going to see something on the screen here, but apparently not. But we can, at some point, we will make available to you a little more depth on those, and certainly they're available on the web, because we don't want to just do a how we did it for ad nauseum here. But we'll spend about 5 minutes apiece talking about those stories. They'll give you a brief description of the what, why, and how of each of these stories, along with a summary of the impact of the investigation. You'll see that domestic corruption and the reporting about it takes many different forms. Then we'll have the panel discuss the challenges of doing these difficult stories in this difficult age, and we'll open it up for some quality time for your questions. We're going to begin with one of my personal heroes, Walt Bogdanich, the assistant editor for investigations at the New York Times. Walt is the winner of not one, not two, but 3 Pulitzer Prizes, 1 for the Wall Street Journal and 2 for the Times, where he has worked since 2001. He's also produced investigative reports for 60 Minutes and for ABC News. Walt has made a career out of rooting out corruption, whether in tobacco companies or medical laboratories, Chinese pharmaceutical companies, or most recently, commuter railroads. That one, published last year, revealed a workers' compensation scheme by retired employees of the Long Island Railroad. I'll ask Walt to tell you more about the story and the results.
Thank you, David. I continue to be amazed when I hear my colleagues say that I'd like to do investigative reporting, but I really just can't get any good ideas. Okay, let's assume that you have such an offensive personality that you are incapable of developing the kinds of sources that Lowell's talking about. There's hope, because by being observant of the world around you, there are many, many good stories. When I moved to Long Island, against my wishes, my wife got a job over there. I don't know how in the heck I ended up over there, but there I was. It didn't take me long as a commuter to realize that the management of the Long Island Railroad was a very fertile ground for investigation. On my first commuting day, I got on the platform, got on the train, and I realized there are things here that just don't make sense. A little background. My station is the end of the line. So when you get off the train, you don't stand on the platform, you go home. When you go to work, you don't stand on the platform. You get on one of the several trains that have their motors running with the doors open, and you sit there. So no one goes on the platform. So I'm looking there, and I see these giant television sets that Long Island Railroad management had installed hanging over the platforms. Now, you couldn't hear what was going on those sets, because there was some local, first of all, the engines were running and it was the local station, you could just see somebody's mouth moving. And that lasted about a year before all the sets broke. And I'm thinking, well, who got this contract? And what did they give, to get it? And I see all these benches on the platform, and nobody sits on the platform. So who got the contract to put the darn benches on? And I would go telling people, I didn't do local investigative stuff. I was working for the networks, and then later at the Times I was doing national investigation. I said, somebody's got to look at this darn thing. Somebody's got to look at it. There are stories to be had. Well, year after year, no one would do it. Local papers wouldn't do it. I tried to get the local media to do it. In fact, at an IRE conference, Investigative Reporters and Editors Conference, where you never give up ideas to people, in front of a whole room of reporters, I said, please, somebody do the Long Island Railroad. Because, all you have to do is get on the train, and you realize that these conductors treat you like hostages. It's as though, if they didn't have torture on their mind, you'd be surprised. So at any rate, finally, I said, well, okay, nobody's going to do it. I'm going to do it. And what I found, I got a tip on the fact that workers were retiring early on disability. Well, how much? So that's pretty much where we started. And what I found my team found, was that while the railroad was winning all these national awards for worker safety, up to 97% of them were retiring on disability early, which even a stupid person can look at that and say, what's wrong with this picture? And so they were doing that. And not only that, but they would then take these disability passes and they would use them to get state passes, which allowed them to play golf for free on while they're disabled, on all these golf courses. And they covered every blade of grass like locusts, of these public golf courses, choking off any ability of just normal taxpayers to play these courses. So as a golfer and as a writer on the train, I was very offended. I want to bring these guys down, No, that's lawyers. My lawyer's here. He doesn't want me to say stuff like that. David, I'm sorry. I'm just making that up. Cool. Well, surprisingly, it had a big result. I think other papers probably wish they had done it, local papers. It led to more than a half dozen investigations, government investigations. One person's been indicted so far. People are not getting disabilities anymore of the kind that they were getting before. People are not getting these passes to go play golf anymore. So that's good. There have been other things. But one problem is I still ride the railroad, and they all know who I am. So anyhow, that's my thumbnail sketch of what I've been up to the last year.
Next, we have Martin Reynolds, editor of the Oakland Tribune. And Martin and I are among that increasingly rare breed of editor who has pretty much grown up at one newspaper. He began at the Trib as an intern and worked as a reporter and made his way up to the top news position. He's shown extraordinary commitment to his community, especially to investigating the crime that continues to plague Oakland. He's currently working on a project that will look at how many people are touched by a single murder. It'll examine the financial toll that Oakland's violence takes on that city, not just on the neighborhoods where it occurs, and at the money that residents spend on such things as private security patrols and burglar bars. Most notably for our purposes today, Martin is one of the 3 lead editors on the nationally recognized Chauncey Bailey Project, cooperative effort of several Bay Area news organizations, universities, and centers. As most of you know, this was brought together to honor and continue the work of Chauncey Bailey, the editor of the weekly Oakland Post, who was gunned down in August of 2007 while reporting on suspicious activities at a place called Your Black Muslim Bakery. And I'll ask Martin to take it from here in explaining the stories and particularly the Tribune's role in them.
Okay. Thank you. How are you all doing today? First, I want to say it's a pleasure and honor to be here. This is a wonderful event, and I'm very honored to represent the Oakland Tribune. The Bailey Project, obviously, I knew Chauncey. He and I worked together as colleagues. We were both reporters, and then later on, I was his editor. And so, obviously, his assassination, I think it's fair to call it that, on August 2nd, 2007, was a huge blow for many who knew him personally, but it also was a call to action professionally. And the Chauncey Bailey Project was really formed really in the spirit of the Arizona Project, and those will remember that it was formed in 1976 after Arizona Republic reporter Don Bowles was killed. His car was blown up. And at the time after Chauncey was killed, just a few days afterward, Sandy Close from New America Media, Dory Maynard, called sort of a hodgepodge collection of journalists together at a restaurant in Berkeley to talk about, well, what would we do in the wake of this? And it was decided at that time that the journalism community would carry on Chauncey's work. And at the time he was killed, he was working on a story about Your Black Muslim Bakery that is now defunct, looking at its finances. It's an organization that has deep roots in Oakland politically. It was a player, very much so. And it has had some pretty dubious things connected to it, murders, the the patriarch at the bakery, Yusuf Ali Bey, when he died of cancer, he was on trial for rape charges of underage minors. And there's a whole slew of other issues that was going on. But the story that Chauncey was working on at the time had to do with the bakery's finances. It was in turmoil. The patriarch had died, and there was a war going on between the older sect and the younger sect to gain control of this organization that had been a moneymaker. And so we decided that the Tribune was asked to lead a collection, and at that point, we, along with a TV partner, radio, the Center for Investigative Reporting, well, it was Rosie, and then he managed to land a job at the time, and UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism, San Francisco State, as well as philanthropic partners, all got involved, and we all sat in a room. Now, you can imagine a room full of journalists who work for competing news organizations. Now, just picture that for a second. It's like, you remember the song We Are the World? When they recorded that, and everybody comes in, and like I think Michael Jackson didn't want to sing or put headphones on, and Prince was all pissed off. It was like, the first day, it was like that. And so we sort of had to kind of calm our egos a little bit and sort of come together, because the idea was here that one of our colleagues had been slain. And it didn't matter who you worked for or what you were about. We wanted to come together and get to the bottom of what happened. And so it came together. And for those of you who want to, I'm going to try and capture this in 5 minutes, which is very difficult because there's been hundreds of stories written. So I would suggest you go to chaunceybailey.org, which was put together by the folks over at CIR, excellent website, and it has everything that we've done. So what the project, I'm going to touch on the 4 areas that the project, I think, really uncovered some things, and they are that the project uncovered that there clearly was a conspiracy to kill Bailey. As of now, Devondre Broussard, who was at that time, 19-year-old dishwasher who was working at the bakery, he's the only person charged in the killing of Bailey at this time. But we believe that there were more people involved. Everyone who knows Devondre can tell that he's not the kind of individual who probably undertook this on his own. He was ordered. This is what we believe. We also have shown that the lead detective in the case, Sergeant Derwin Longmire, who has since been transferred out of homicide into patrol, and they said that it was a routine thing, but we pretty much know that it was likely was punitive, although we can't report that because we cannot confirm it, so don't quote me. And we found that this detective clearly ignored crucial evidence that would have pointed to a conspiracy to kill Bailey. And there's a lot of reasons for why that is. Some say that he has a more sort of a mentor relationship with Yusuf Bey, the son of the patriarch. And we've reported on their conversations that border on like, he's my little brother kind of thing. And all the experts that we've talked to say that if there's somebody investigating someone or the potential that this person could be connected to a capital crime, you don't have conversations like, we're 2 black men and we're trying to just make it through the struggle, man. I mean, I think we show that that's pretty inappropriate kind of conduct to have. In addition, we found that the department is incredibly dysfunctional and overly reliant on interrogations to solve crimes, not investigations. And in large part because the department has had to implement reforms that were born out of a previous corruption scandal that has put the emphasis on internal policing rather than investigating crimes. And there's an irony there. And in addition to that, the outgrowth of the project has resulted in other very important bits of information. There's the sources that Lowell talked about that he was able to cultivate. Once they saw that the Bailey Project was involved in this kind of reporting of a department that has really been dysfunctional for a long time, they began to come forward and give us other information that was very essential to creating a police department that works well and works for the community it serves. And that was specifically, there was a warrant scandal where it had found that officers had given false information on affidavits to secure search warrants. And as a result of that, numerous officers have been of that reporting. Numerous officers have been suspended, and there are other scandals that I could go on for 15 or 20 minutes that are involving this department, and it's really a problem. But what I hope we touch on here today, and I think that the Chauncey Bailey Project is a great example of, is that while the Bailey Project was not put together because the Bay Area News Group and Oakland Tribune didn't have the economic wherewithal to do the investigation, there has been a wonderful collaboration that has come about and that I think could be a model that could serve in other markets as we deal with these economic difficulties of continuing the important work of investigative reporting.
Thank you. We'll talk some about that certainly in this session, but there's a session tomorrow that's focused very much on that question and how these collaborations can work going forward. Our next panelist is one of the finest journalists working in television news today, Rhonda Schwartz, senior producer of the Brian Ross Investigative Unit at ABC News. And that unit provides in-depth investigative reports for all of ABC News television and radio broadcast, as well as an investigative webpage called The Blotter on abcnews.com. And like Walt, Rhonda has built a highly successful and highly decorated career out of rooting out corruption here and overseas, first at NBC and for the past 14 years at ABC. She's won 6 Emmys for investigative work, and a particular area of focus for her has been the corrupting influence of money on the American political system. Over the last year, she's turned her sights to the nation's financial crisis and has examined the roots of the subprime mortgage crisis, the development of risky financial products, and most notably, the awe-inspiring corruption of one Bernard Madoff. And I'll ask Rhonda to speak about her work.
Thank you very much. And it's a tribute to Lowell's understanding of how television works that the producer of the team is sitting up here while my esteemed partner, Mr. Ross, who is normally the public face and the writer and editorial director of our investigative reporting team, is sitting here. And I would tell you that I really wasn't nervous about talking and looking forward to it until Brian asked me 6 times this morning whether I was nervous. So I'll do my best to, not being the wordsmith of the team, to bring forward a bit about our experience covering Bernie Madoff. It all began the week of very intense reporting on another scandal. The pompadour, track-suited wearing governor of Illinois. You may remember it was a week we couldn't believe. The corruption scandal that broke in Illinois, a state where my understanding is that you're not really guilty until you've been convicted twice. So it was a busy week, and we were having a lot of fun digging into that scandal, and we were on the air, on the web, we were all over it, and basically crawled out of the office Friday night feeling like, wow, who could believe this one? And I think it was around 7:30 at night, a little squib, it might have been an AP wire, came across my BlackBerry, and it said, Wall Street figure arrested for $50 billion Ponzi scheme. Now, at that point, I looked at it. Almost immediately, an email came back from Brian Ross that said, does that say 50 billion with a B? Next, from our senior investigative reporter, Rich Esposito, who has covered the New York court system and everything that moves for many years, he wrote back. His was a very simple email. He said, this looks like a big story. It was a prophetic understatement, and I think even over that weekend, none of our bosses quite appreciated, and neither did we, what was about to unfold. So we sort of set our team into motion to see what we could find out, and not only to dig in and report the story, but ultimately how to tell it on television, which a few weeks later we put together a 2-part 2020 story, which you can take a look at, see it online on our website at any point if you want to have a look. But first, it became clear the victims, Steven Spielberg, Mort Zuckerman came forward. He lost $30 million. It destroyed his philanthropy. This was almost an atom bomb in the world of Jewish philanthropy. And one of our producers, Anna Schechter, had already been working down in Palm Beach with Larry Leamer, who was writing a new book about the elite of Palm Beach. And so we dispatched Anna down to Palm Beach, and she began poking around. It wasn't long before she began to uncover there had been sort of a yard sale going on famous Worth Avenue. We found 2 weeks before his arrest, Bernie had bought himself a $1,200 polo shirt and a $2,000 pair of cashmere slacks. But elsewhere on Worth Avenue, jewelry stores were becoming pawn shops as victims of Madoff's scheme came to divest themselves because they were all broke. So as Anna began to investigate, we began to see the role of what have become the feeder funds. How did Bernie do it? How did he attract, how did he dupe all these, high-profile folks? Well, Palm Beach was a big source of his customer base, and it revolved around the Palm Beach Country Club. And this was the country club that was basically formed because this is where the Jews were shut out of the other country clubs. And that's where Bernie did a lot of his business. And as Larry Lemer told us, you had to be the elite of the elite to get in with Bernie. And that was about half the club. Bernie was very aloof. And so you couldn't just go up to Bernie and approach Bernie. Bernie had his feeder funds. In this case, he had a guy named Robert Jaffe, who was a real bon vivant of Palm Beach. And he was the connection at the Palm Beach Country Club. And if you wanted to get in with Bernie, first you had to schmooze through Robert Jaffe. So that he had set up this sort of wall that it was, if you had to work a little hard to get in, that was what was going to suck you in. So Anna, while all this was erupting, Anna found that Robert Jaffe was basically tooling around Palm Beach in his little MGB, going out for dinner as if nothing had happened. So she followed him one night to one of his favorite restaurants and waited patiently for him outside. And she very carefully approached him as he was leaving the restaurant, a very attractive, charming young woman who put out her hand and said, "Oh, Mr. Jaffe, I'd like to talk with you." As she reached out her hand with the camera, he turned, grabbed the camera, threw it to the ground, started screaming at her. And his wife joined in, and she was ushered off the premises. And it wasn't much longer before we got a phone call from his attorney saying, "How dare you? He's a victim. He's a victim." Well, that was sort of a clue he was not so much a victim. And the Massachusetts Secretary of State said his protestations that he's a victim is like being you're the pilot of the plane that crashes, but you're only a passenger. So we began to see and bring forward and identify the individuals who are the people who helped Bernie do this. Brian, in particular, was fascinated by the fact that Bernie lived in the old Pulitzer Mansion in West Palm Beach, was the scene of a great, notorious, as Brian put it, it was a scandal involving cocaine and three-way sex somehow involving a trumpet. So there had been a long history in this town. Yeah, it's television.
Those are quaint times now, aren't they?
That's right. But most importantly of all, Brian kept saying, "How is it that Bernie's still in that apartment?" Everyone kept saying, "How is it that the prosecutors have allowed him to stay in house arrest while all around him his victims?" There were suicides at this point, bankruptcies, and we became obsessed with the idea of how could we get a look at Bernie and what was going on in that apartment. So two of our top producers, Joe Rhee and Len Tepper, went out and beat the streets and finally came back having found the keys to a vacant apartment that looked across the way into Bernie's penthouse, where we set up an observation post. And I wish we had the film to show you, because much to our amazement, what did we see? There was Bernie Madoff sitting in the den of his plush decorated apartment, basically, as Brian put it, doing God knows what on the internet. He had a late model Apple computer propped up in the window, and he was sitting there happily having a little Perrier, working on his computer. We watched for several days, and for as far as we could see, he appeared to be possibly Skyping because he was talking into the machine. So this, of course, raises the question, what in the world were the prosecutors thinking to allow him to be sitting here with the computer Skyping away? When Bernie would get up from the computer, Ruthie would sit down and go to work as well. So the pictures that we produced that were part of this 2020 story really were sort of a shot across the bow of the very, very famous and proud Southern District of New York. After the story ran, we heard a lot of rumblings. You know, have they fallen down on this case? Is this an embarrassment to them? What is going on here? And I think it's one of the interesting questions still to be mined about, you know, what has been going on with this Bernie Madoff case. The interesting thing, I think, in terms of investigative reporting in the times that we live in, this two-part 2020 story was one of the most popular stories we have put on the air in many months. It was a vast audience. It was the biggest audience on television that night. People really do want to know about this stuff. And, David asked us to talk about sort of the impact of our reporting. In this case, this is an ongoing saga that continues to go, but one of the cartoonists, I think, sort of summed this up best, that it's been a real kick in the teeth and a lesson to many folks who basically said, you know, the lesson of Bernie Madoff is that you learn to take your money out of your 401k, invest it someplace safe, like the office NCAA pool.
Thank you, Rhonda. Next, we'll hear from Mark Smith, who's an investigative producer at WFAA TV in Dallas. Mark spent 15 years as a newspaper reporter in Texas and Washington before he figured out how much more money he could make in television. And he joined WFAA in 2000. WFAA is, even among the ink-stained of us, is widely regarded as really one of the finest local television news operations in the world. And Mark immediately made that station even better. Among his most celebrated stories was one that led to the dismissal of drug charges against more than 70 defendants and convictions of 2 police officers and 3 drug informants. This year, he and his unit were the first local TV station in history to receive the highest honor in Columbia University's DuPont Awards, the Gold Baton. In the series that Mark will discuss today, Money for Nothing, he found that domestic corruption and incompetence crossed the U.S.-Mexico border, discovered that the United States Export-Import Bank was routinely making loans to businesses connected to the Mexican drug cartel. He'll tell you more about that.
Well, thank you, and it's an honor to be here, and thanks, Lowell. I see in the program, and I don't have any problems with, you know, who's ever out there on that, but I see that I was supposed to talk about an informant. And on that particular story, and I'll do a segue into the export-import, in that particular story, sometimes you're blessed with internal documents that you just get, and you do sort of an inside-out investigation where you get key documents or a whistleblower, and you kind of build your story out. But I won't discuss that story. It was an informant that participated in supervised murder on the U.S. payroll, and that's a whole other issue. On this story, the Export-Import Bank, it was a story where we worked on the outside in and worked our way in. I had a tip, and it was about an agency I really knew little about, the Export-Import Bank. And the Export-Import Bank, just for those, and many of you may be familiar with it, but the XM, as it's known, is an entity, it's a federal entity, and it's designed to bolster exports. And it does that by providing loans and loan guarantees to foreign companies or countries, and it's designed for them to buy U.S. products. And so I got a tip that there were some real problems with the bank, and in part because in the 90s, and give a little history, it was formed in the Depression, and in the 90s it became known sort of because we're here, and it was known as the Boeing Bank because about half the loans went to Boeing. About $500 million went to Enron, by the way, and that disappeared. GE and Halliburton are other key clients, if you will, of the bank. But because of the problem, in an effort to try to bring this bank so it would make loans to smaller companies, Congress in 2002 began a program that 20% of the loans had to go to smaller companies. Part of those loans were supposed to go to medium or small companies in Mexico. And we got this tip. So what I did is I put a FOIA request into XM, and I waited 6 months, and finally this big box comes in. And I almost forgot about it, frankly. And it came in the door, and I opened it up, ripped it open, and I started going through these documents. It included the invoices, the bill of lading, various documents that were supposed to be fully filled out. Many of them had all kinds of problems. Red flags jumped out. The thing that first came across was a loan for about $8 million for a company that supposedly sold goods to Mexico along the border. And the address was I-10 Dallas. Well, there is no I-10 in Dallas. Okay, a simple MapQuest review would have determined that. Another one I came across very quickly was 39 passenger buses from a company out of Houston, Texas. Well, if you went on Google and just pulled up the website for that particular bus company, you would see that they didn't sell that particular type of bus. Called him up and I said, did you sell some 39 Freightliner XB buses? He said, I don't even know what you're talking about. We don't sell those. We don't sell to Mexico. Looked at another thing, 20 or 14 coach buses in this case out of the Midwest. The sale never occurred. So on those particular loans, there was a guy named Andrew Parker out of San Antonio that was kind of the point man on a lot of those loans. We tried to get an interview with Andrew. He wasn't around, was unavailable, so we thought we'd just drive down there and try to find him. We drove out in front of Andrew's mansion, which is about 13,000 square feet. He had 2 Ferraris, a Bentley, a Rolls, a Hummer, and a 5-car garage, swimming pool, and in the backyard, he had a beautiful, these live oaks with these little misters, so when he could throw his parties, everybody could be cool in the hot Texas summer. He didn't have any other job other than to be a broker on these loans. So anyway, Andrew wasn't around, so we jumped in the car and headed down on sort of a, lack of a better word, sort of a kamikaze mission down through the Rio Grande Valley and Laredo, pulling these documents out of the box and stopping to see if some of the companies that supposedly had sold these loans, if they existed and what they would have to say. We crossed in Mexico too and checked with some of the people. Almost every one of the documents involved were either fraudulent or had been skewed significantly. Bottom line, I mean, we have a limited time here, but one of the things on Parker, which was interesting, was and the loans also went over to Juarez and El Paso, and we tracked that down, and some of the companies had just obviously kind of funky names, Ripper Constructions, Spanglish things that just didn't make sense. Track some of those people down, and the massive scope of it, and at least prior to this economic meltdown, seemed pretty big. We talked about maybe $250 million in fraudulent loans over about 2 years, just in Mexico. That doesn't include Africa, the Philippines, and other programs. Anyway, just to ratchet this back, since then there's been an inspector general that's been added to the export-import. One of the ladies that was sort of the loan, Parker was having a fling with one of these ladies at the bank. They went to Cancun, tracked down some of those records. They stayed in resorts, but she was sort of the entryway on these loans into the bank, and she has since left. There's a criminal prosecution on another lady, and there we are.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, we're pleased to have Marcus Stern, who's a Washington-based reporter for the investigative nonprofit center ProPublica. And before joining the center last summer, Marcus was a reporter for the Washington Bureau of Copley News Service, which is the parent of, for a little while longer, of the San Diego Union Tribune. While working there, he reported extensively on immigration issues, including exposing abuses at the INS, particularly at a psychiatric detention facility that was closed as a result of his reporting. He wrote so many investigative stories on the INS that he became known within the agency as Buzzkill. His crowning achievement, though, was the undressing of a shockingly corrupt congressman by the name of Randy Duke Cunningham. And reporting by Marcus and his colleagues ultimately led to Cunningham's imprisonment and won them the Pulitzer Prize. So he'll tell us more about that story.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here. Let me say that my name is Marcus, but my friends call me Mark, so if you want to beat me up during the question and answer session, call me Mark. This story, I think, first of all, 2 points right off the bat. One is that what I'm about to say, I hope will underscore the importance of the disappearance of regional bureaus in Washington, regional newspapers, because they are disappearing. And what we did was a regional story. Cunningham was a regional story. The other thing, it's the importance of allowing reporters to kick over stones. We kick over stones throughout our career, and many times there's nothing under them. Sometimes there is something under them, but it doesn't pan out as it's not what we thought it was. But occasionally, like this one, it does pan out. And so I think it shows how important it is to allow reporters to kick over a lot of stones. Cunningham, right now, the central figure in this scandal, is serving. He's in the third year of his 8-year, 4-month prison sentence. Dusty Fogo, who is another co-conspirator, is about to begin his 3-year prison sentence. It was supposed to begin on April 7th, a few days from now, but he's gotten a 1-week reprieve so that he can talk with the prosecutors who are investigating the disappearance of the videotapes of the harsh interrogations that the U.S. engaged in Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib. And there are a couple of defense contractors who are about to go to jail to serve their terms. One of them is a guy named Brent Wilkes, who's got a 12-year sentence he's appealing. The other one is a guy named Mitchell Wade, who is going to be starting his jail term sometime very shortly too. I think it's about 3 years. So that's kind of the scoreboard. How did what they had back in June 2005, before we broke this story, was they had this underground corruption juggernaut that they had put together. It was all based on earmarks. On the surface, all you saw were a congressman and a couple of defense contractors over here. They had all wrapped themselves in the flag. They were all pro-defense. They called themselves patriots. They all admonished people who wanted to, not admonished, but they berated people who wanted to cut the defense budget at this time when defense spending was ever more necessary, particularly after 9/11. You didn't know, nobody suspected anything. These were just disparate individuals. Nobody knew they were collaborating. Nobody knew that they were abusing the earmark system. And one story actually triggered the sort of implosion of this whole juggernaut. It happened very quickly within weeks. And so what I want to do is just tell you as quickly as possible how that one story happened, because I was very much a part of it. And again, it underscores the importance of allowing reporters to kick over these stones. One afternoon in May of 2005, I had time on my hands and decided to figure out why it is that Duke Cunningham had gone to Saudi Arabia twice. I know Saudi Arabia, I knew Duke Cunningham, and I knew the two were a bad fit. Duke liked to drink and he liked to womanize, and you don't get to do a lot of that in Saudi Arabia. So I sort of went all over the internet and through databases. I suspected, well, this must be a foreign military sale. He must be trying to help some defense contractor who's supporting him get this foreign military sale. But none of that panned out, and to this day I still don't know why he went to Saudi Arabia. But my final thing before I was going to give up was to see if he'd upgraded his living accommodations. And lo and behold, he and his wife a year and a half earlier had purchased a $2.55 million mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, which is a very upscale area where you have movie stars and millionaires, multimillionaires, but you don't have a congressman and his wife who is a school administrator living in this area. So I said, how did he buy this house? And I looked at, he sold his old house for $1.67 million. He had purchased it for $400,000, but the San Diego real estate market is notoriously hot, and it was definitely at that time. Maybe the house did rise in value, and that provided him with his down payment for the $2.55 million house. But then I noticed the person who bought it, the congressman's house, was actually a company, something called 1523 New Hampshire Avenue, Inc., which I recognize as probably a address in Washington, D.C. So I went to see what 1523 New Hampshire Avenue, Inc. was, and it turns out it's a company registered in the state of Nevada to a man named Mitchell Wade, who I'd never heard of before. And there was another company that Mitchell Wade had set up and licensed and registered in Nevada, and it was called MZM Inc. I'd never heard of MZM Inc. either, so I Googled it, and it turned out it was a defense contractor. And then I went to one of the links on the corporate website, and I saw a story that bragged about how this contractor had gone from no contracts to having more than $100 million worth of contracts, and had become part of the top 100 contractors in America, defense contractors in America, all in the span of basically the house sale that I was looking at. So I went back and I looked to see what Mitchell Wade, the defense contractor, did with the house he bought from the congressman who sits on the Defense Appropriations Committee. And what he did was he put it right back on the market. It sat on the market for 8 months, eventually sold for $700,000 less than the purchase price. This is during, again, a roaring market, housing market. So we looked at comparables, and we saw that, in fact, the defense contractor had substantially overpaid the member of Congress for this house. The next step was to contact these people. When I called MZM Inc., Mitchell Wade wouldn't talk to me, but I laid out my line of inquiry for the person who would talk to me. And after I finished, there was a pause, and then he hung up. And I called the congressman, and he got on the phone with me very generously and admitted that he had helped Mitchell Wade get some of these contracts. He had supported him. He said, "There's nothing wrong with this. I do it for other contractors as well, other defense firms." What he wasn't connecting here is that these other firms had not purchased his house at a substantially inflated price. The story broke, and then from there, the whole thing imploded in the weeks after that.
Thank you very much, Mark. These are obviously remarkable stories by remarkable journalists. They will be screened during the break in the Hearst Mining Building, where we had the opening reception, if you want to take a look at video clips from these stories. This is the kind of journalism that both Thomas Jefferson and David Byrne agree is essential for the preservation of our democracy. But what of it going forward? Who's going to do this kind of work, and how are they going to do it? What stories will not be covered? How much public money will that void cost? How many lives will be lost? We'll begin with just a couple of questions that I have, and then open it up to yours. For the sake of getting as many questions in as we can, if you could raise your hand now if you have a question. I'm not going to call on you now, but we can get the mics out to a couple of people. Let's start related to to Rhonda's story. We see unfolding before our eyes the most compelling domestic corruption story in many, many years, the scandal in the U.S. financial markets and the banking industry. Bernie Madoff is certainly the poster child for that story, but we'll start with Rhonda and anybody else who wants to weigh in on this. How did we miss this story? And what are we going to do about it for the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in this room full of top investigative reporters, who ever heard of Bernie Madoff before that Friday night? Anybody? No, I mean, it really is an astounding thing that a scam of that magnitude could show up like that. It's a very good question. We have sort of doggedly covered a number of financial scandals over the last few years. We were early on reporting on Countrywide, State Farm. We even brought forward a story about a whistleblower who tried to, from within the SEC, who was trying to investigate J.P. Morgan without success. Some of these stories, I will tell you, that we had to fight onto the air. I think we had to promise our firstborn children to Good Morning America to bring forward the SEC whistleblower. They didn't get a lot of traction, but they were out there. We were sort of working on them. I don't know what how one would have foreseen Bernie Madoff, but certainly this larger collective financial collapse. To many respects, I think, the business reporting community is known for churning out daily reports, daily press releases, reporting the results. The stock market is up, the stock market is down. And in many respects, I think the There's some great business investigative reporting, and looking back on it, I think some of them will be seen to be pretty prescient about it.
Walt, what are your thoughts on that? You've worked in
My
business
thoughts are,
investigations.
how in the world did no one notice that this billion upon billion dollar operation had a storefront accounting firm with like one guy doing his work? You don't need more of a red flag than that. And how could the SEC look at this thing, and or all the regulators look at it and say, well, what's wrong with this picture? That's not how things work. I mean, it's amazing that wasn't picked up on. And I think Rhonda's right that everybody's covering the stories of the day, and there's a lot of conventional wisdom that goes on in how we do these things. And I mean, sure, there were some warning stories, stories that warned about, problems over the horizon, but certainly not enough of them. And it gives us a good opportunity to look back and figure out why we didn't do more. I mean, it's a good time to do that.
Let's talk about what's happening in the business at large and how it's affecting the sort of work that you all have described. Martin, I'll start with you. No offense intended, but your owner is among the most notorious for cutting costs and cutting back on journalistic resources. And I understand your reporting staff has been cut by about 2/3. You're clearly an editor of commitment and ambition. How are you managing this?
Well, it's an interesting thing, and it's a little frustrating at times. And well, there is some irony here too, in that, my owner, Dean Singleton, who owns the Oakland Tribune and I think some 54 other daily newspapers across the country, mostly in California, has had a model that has certainly not made him the friend of many journalists over time, going into markets, particularly distressed markets, and making those newspapers profitable. And the way you generally do that, oftentimes, is by cutting staff and not necessarily paying people a lot of money. And some of the other things that he's also have done, which I think in this environment are probably have kept us in a little bit better of a position, but I don't necessarily think are always good for the publication that you're on. For instance, common sports sections that go across different publications. The Bay Area News Group is in a cluster of papers, and so you'll have a section such as features, business, sports that essentially feed the entire news group and are run common in all the papers, and then your front page and your metro section will be very unique to your particular market. And we've all sort of gotten used to this reality. I've always said that one day when I grow up, I'd like to work at a paper where everybody's in one building and we all get to write for that one particular publication. I don't know if that'll ever happen now. But that being said, it's a difficult thing, and I think what we're doing right now in the group is sort of coming together. We formed some committees within the organization to really assess, where our coverage priority is going to lie now. Because the thing that's really frustrating and I think difficult for reporters is feeling as though all of a sudden you're no longer able to be the paper of record as you once were for your community. And I think that we actually are having those we have admitted that to ourselves. That with our reporting, the number of reporters we have now, there's no way that we can be the paper of record for Oakland as we once were. We can be the paper of record in certain particular areas, yes, but not in the way that we once were. And so that's a big departure for reporters. And, they get real surly when they feel like there's something that they can't cover or they're out there in the community. So it's difficult to manage, and it's frustrating. That being said, we have come to the conclusion that the place where we can hang our hat and where we have to hang our hat is investigative reporting, watchdog journalism. And so has become our primary mission. Step away from the process as best we can and be more probative, be more analytical, and try and distill information as best we can for our readers.
Great. And Mark Stern, will you talk about, you mentioned the erosion of Washington bureaus for regional papers. Would you talk specifically about what happened to the Union Tribunes, and then why and how you made the decision to cross over into ProPublica, and just any other thoughts you might have about that erosion?
Am I allowed to cry while I tell this story? First of all, I'd like to react to the earlier question. I spent most of my career in Washington. The question being, what's happening to the press corps? How are they missing these big stories? And just as with business reporters, Washington reporters tend to get somewhat intoxicated by or somehow co-opted by the culture of Washington and the people they're covering. Washington is a giant blather machine. You get plumes of blather that rise up. There are people that are all over town who are paid every day to put out blather. You get reporters who focus all on the same kabuki. Nobody's really looking behind the scenes, or not many people are looking behind the scenes. You have a lot of reporters just writing about the show. And so part of it is our fault. We really do need to stop covering the show, stop doing the daily stuff, and start thinking about what's happening and what's wrong. Going back to the other thing is that we have to stop, I think, to some extent, the corporate ego that's involved. And we heard about the sharing here, the collaboration. But if somebody from one news organization breaks a story, other news organizations, if they can, they'll run away from it and just pretend it didn't happen or that it's not important. And we have to be a lot more even-handed and thoughtful about what's important and what isn't important. If it's a good story, whether we broke it or not, we need to jump on it and acknowledge it. Our bureau, which was 11 strong when we broke the Cunningham story, doesn't exist anymore. It's a sort of sad-looking office vacant on the 11th floor of the National Press Building with just sort of the clutter of 64 years of journalism waiting to be carted off as soon as if there ever is a tenant for that space. And the parent company, the Copley newspapers, has sold off all of its papers since then, except for the Union Tribune. I'm sorry, they did just sell the Union Tribune for somewhere under $50 million, maybe $20, $30 million, even though the real estate is worth $100 in itself. So it's that empire, that little empire, which had been around for quite a while, is gone.
And Mark, what about local TV news? Give your take on that and the place of investigative reporting as you see it moving forward.
Well, I can sort of speak from my own experience, and is it this global view, or but it's apparent to me that in what we do, we have two reporters, producer, myself, and a photographer editor, and I think the model for local television with all the cuts, there's this essential need. And much like even in print, I think there's a need to have short-term, medium-term, and long-term projects going simultaneously. The day of disappearing for 3 months and coming back with the Holy Grail and plopping it down to an editor, or coming into a local television station and having a two-part series every 3 months or every 6 months just doesn't fly. I think you gotta, if we're going to survive, I think, especially in local television, is to have some short-term stories where the face of the investigative reporter is out there once, maybe twice a week, if at all possible, but keep the medium-term and long-term things going. And I think that's a question of, instead of crying about it, I think at some point you have to, we've had a limited budget always, so I think and we had one editor photographer, so we had to manage our resources very tightly, and we try to have, several dozen to 3 dozen stories we're working simultaneously with a board and a spreadsheet, and we know exactly where we're at, 20%, 40%, 60%, 80%. Key interviews, are they done yet? What's the liftoff date, air date? But I think you have to just get better, organized on it. And I think, ultimately, in a democratic society, I think investigative reporting is going to be there in some shape, form, or fashion. Otherwise, I don't know how you have a democratic society. But that said, I think you do the best you can. And I think in our case, the brand that we have at WFA, sort of the franchise that we have, I think the corporation is behind us, and it's one of the things that separate us from the brand A, B, or B and C and D, and that we have some sort of substantive, hopefully, stories that impact lives.
And my last question before we open it up, I'm curious from any of you about the impact of the web on investigative reporting, particularly this sort of really tightly focused domestic corruption investigation. And we hear a lot about crowdsourcing when we go to these conferences, and yet it seems it's always people can always come up with one great example, which is the Josh Marshall story about what a great tool crowdsourcing is. And so I'm curious, either that or just the impact of the web in general. Anybody?
Well, I will just say in order to keep investigative reporting flourishing, one of the things we did was set up an investigative reporting website. Our team provides reports for all the shows at ABC, but the website that we started about 2 years ago is a daily site, and we do try to do daily investigative reporting. We have found that a lot of the stories that we want to dig into, that we want to get started, they may not be ready for the full-blown prime-time exposure, but we can sort of put a marker down and start working the story and start developing it. It's beneficial in a lot of ways. It encourages the sources see that you're really serious, you're starting to report, stuff is starting to come out. It has also a lot of the executive producers who weren't sure, couldn't quite understand maybe where we were going with this, begin to see the response on the web. We haven't had an experience with the crowd-based sourcing, but we have gotten some gangbuster tips on our tip line from individuals, the most famous of which was the tip we got about the really obscene, sexually explicit Mark Foley emails, which led to that story unraveling. But since then, we receive a lot of tips that way too. But we see that now as sort of the core of our operation. And we know we can get a story out there under our own steam, regardless of whether we're going to have a big budget or a showcase on the air.
ProPublica, which is the life raft that pulled me out of the waters, and I now work for, has just hired someone named Amanda Mickle, who is an expert in crowdsourcing. She crowdsourced for the Huffington Post. And Steve, you might be able to say more about it than I can, but I think that we're going to try and sort of incorporate the citizens out there, the citizens journalists who have access to what's happening in their little worlds, but also may just run through the open secrets to see who's giving campaign contributions to people, and hope that we can harness the people out there on the other end of the webland.
Anybody else? Okay, let's take some questions from you all. Raise your hand and you'll be given a mic. We have one down here as well.
Thank you. A question Mark, you brought up...
Which Mark?
Mark Stern. You brought up a important... it was brought up a couple of times, but this whole idea of, how could we miss these big stories? Well, you said they weren't missed. I mean, somebody somewhere, had done those stories, but they were missed by, the big papers of records, so to speak. And my question is, and everybody's kind of realizing, well, that's not, we can't do that anymore, where we just pretend like a story doesn't exist. I mean, we don't have the resources anymore to do that. Martin, this is a question for you in particular, are you linking to stories that the alternative media in your community is doing and linking to them and saying, hey, did you see this story? Because that's the thing we have. I'm from Voice of San Diego, and we noticed that from the Union Tribune, is that we would break a story and they still, don't do a good job of pretending like, pretending like it didn't happen.
Yeah, that goes back to...
We're trying to push people, I'm sorry, Mark, trying to push people to just link to other people's stories and say, hey, this is a big deal that our competitor did. Is that something that you guys are doing more of these days?
We are.
I think, everybody is.
Yeah. We've made a homepage for our investigative site that we have put aggregation on, and I would encourage everybody here, send us your good stories. We do provide links every day, sort of what we think is interesting and what we're reading on the web. And many of them are stories that down the road we want to cover ourselves, but the first good story we are putting there.
And our website has a couple of channels. I mean, on the one hand, we've got investigative reporters who are working on projects, but we also have a daily feed of aggregation and sort of smaller stories that we put out there to keep our readership engaged on a daily basis.
I just want to, the very concept, and so many of the stories we'll do, and sort of the regional stories, it seems like, and this is I'm talking to folks here that might totally disagree, but from my rare perspective where I sit, so many of the stories are it's Washington, New York generated on the big picture stuff, and if it's done by one, it's done by them all, and everybody's kind of racing after to do this gangbang type stuff on the same story. I don't see somebody breaking a story and nobody following it if it's done in the Northeast. The problem I have, I find it interesting that all of a sudden there's a real interest after 6,000 people have been killed along the Mexican border here, all of a sudden there's an interest. I hadn't seen a lot of coverage really of that at all. I think if that happened in Canada, I think there would have been all kinds of coverage. Is there racism? There's issues to be explored here. But I think so many of the stories we do locally that really have some impact, and I'm not talking necessarily about us, but other places I've seen, I don't see those being picked up. The mortgage issues, the fraud issues involved in that, we were doing those stories 5 years ago about the people doing these kind of pseudo loans, and the fact that it finally hits. It's a big story. Is that a shock? I don't know. I have a different perspective from where I'm at.
Can I respond quickly to that?
Oh, yeah,
because I think that for television and probably the web, the concept of being an aggregator is a little more palatable. And I think for newspapers, it's been something that we haven't wanted to do. And I remember about 4 or 5 years ago, there was talk when we were redesigning the website. Well, do we want to put for instance, our biggest competitor in the area would be the San Francisco Chronicle. And we regularly, if they break a story oftentimes that it might be in our backyard, we probably won't follow it the next day unless we totally have to, which is obviously not the way to go, right? And we certainly haven't been aggregators of information. Oh, yeah, go see this story, go see that. But that is beginning to change, actually. And as we redesign this site going forward, there's a lot of talk in our organization about, sort of editors as aggregators, so that the reporters are out there doing the work, and then as that thing that story is put up, editors, which now we're also talking about taking the daily budgeting, which is the biggest pain in the ass, of editors out of the hands of those editors and putting it in the hands of a certain group of editors. And then the other editors will be working closely with reporters and then cobbling together reports from any other media, alternative press, whatever it may be, so that this concept of here's our story on this and here is the information that you can go to get everything else on it. So it's changing, but I think it's always been that way, or been that way much longer for the web and for television.
Okay, a question way up at the top there.
There are a lot of newly unemployed journalists out there who might have investigative reporting ideas, but as we all know, investigative reporting is a very litigious business, and I'm wondering if you would feel comfortable as a freelancer going forward with the kind of work you do without the institutional support that you have, particularly legal support, and if you have any advice for freelancers.
Walt, will you take a first run at that one?
As someone who was once sued for $10 billion, I feel myself somewhat qualified to speak on this. Now, I had it, but a lot of people don't, so that's the issue. You can pair up with somebody who does have, a good lawyer. I think, freelance budgets now are being cut, but what we sometimes try and do is when someone brings a good idea to me and they're a freelancer and they're exploring ways to get it out to the public, sometimes there's ways we could work with them. And in fact, I'm working on a story now that was actually brought to me by a freelancer who will now be part of the process, who I don't think would have had the support necessary to get that story out legally and otherwise. So anyhow, I've been waiting to say this line forever, but Lowell does tobacco and he gets Al Pacino to play him. I do tobacco and I get a $10 billion lawsuit. So. Life ain't fair. But we knew that already, right? We wouldn't be here.
Okay,
We'd be out of work.
down here, Mark.
Mark Glazer with PBS Media Shift. I'm curious about when we talked about crowdsourcing or maybe bringing the audience into doing investigations. Investigative journalists have a history of kind of working in a bubble in their own little world. I'm curious how tough it is in just that culture of investigative journalism to actually include more people in that process. Even saying this is what I'm working on ahead of time, like what maybe ABC is doing on their website. How difficult is that, and where are we in that process of changing the mindset if that's going to happen?
I'm going to be curious to see how Steve does it with his crowdsourcing, because, I mean, all of us here, I mean, you know, we're thieves. If someone else puts some idea up there, we're going to go after it. You know, I'm afraid to put out what I'm working on because it's going to take me a long time to work on it, and the competition's going to get on it. So there are ways, I think, with crowdsourcing. I just haven't figured it out yet.
Steve? This is Steve Engelberg. He's the managing editor of ProPublica.
Hi. Yeah, no, I'd be happy to try to channel Amanda Mickle, who has some very strong views on this. And her view is that the initial sort of thought about crowdsourcing as a panacea didn't work out for a fairly good reason, which is that if you have a kind of vague idea and you throw it out on the internet to, you know, 10,000 people and say, I'd like a story idea or I'd like information on this or that, you get back roughly what you'd get back in your newsroom, which is not much. And so she doesn't really call it crowdsourcing. She calls it distributed reporting. It's a different idea. It really requires a kind of journalistic brain on the other end and an editorial sort of idea of how you marshal what it is you're looking for. And we're going to experiment with it. We're going to see where it takes us. She is looking at the stimulus for ProPublica. We've got a major effort underway with WNYC to sort of track how the stimulus money is spent, where it goes, how it is. And we're going to try to create some very specific kinds of reporting. And it's more, at least in her concept, to be gathering of information rather than it is to sort of put out there, I'm investigating the LIRR and I now need this. Because obviously, Walt, you're right. I mean, if you put that out there today, if we put that out there today, who knows? Some Walt Bogdanich might come and help themselves. It could happen. So this is more sort of primary source gathering of information. And, you know, we'll see how it goes. It's a new world for us, but I think her concept has already proven to be successful through Huffington Post. And with this much money being spent, I'm going to use Bondar as my personal sort of inspiration. And if we put $400 billion out there and $50 billion is wasted, that's a lot of stories.
Up there. Yep. Yes.
Yes, I apologize up front. I'm not a journalist, so this may be a very straightforward. What if I apologize to say I'm an attorney? Yes. Basically, here's my question, because I've wrestled with this, both being a former federal prosecutor and now being a defense attorney. Is you're working on an investigation. Let's say you've got a lead that the chief of staff for a secretary of state is taking bribes and kickbacks to funnel bond refinancing to certain underwriters. Okay, all of a sudden you're doing very well. You've got some what you folks would call external sources coming at you. All of a sudden, a federal prosecutor impanels a grand jury. He starts hauling people in front of a grand jury, and he says to them, which he has a right to do, look, you're not obligated to talk to anyone. If a reporter approaches you, you can or you don't have to talk to anyone. It's up to you. Well, everyone is frightened at that point, and they shut up. No one wants to talk to you. You get a tip, and all of a sudden a court reporter who is taking down the proceedings of the grand jury comes to you and starts giving you information. Now, I know clearly the court reporter is breaking the law. Do you take that information? Do you run with it? Do you have any qualms about using it? And I apologize. That may be a very straightforward answer for everyone in the room. It isn't to me, however, because I did once prosecute a grand juror for doing leaks, and I've now defended someone who was leaking. So I just want to know where the profession stands on that.
Who wants to take a run on that one?
Well, let me ask you this. Which side do you like more? Well, I think the answer is, do you take the information? Of course. What do you do with it? Do you then do what you can to corroborate it? Of course you do. So I think it depends on what the information is. I mean, if somebody wants to come forward and give you information, you're going to take it. what you do with it, how you go about substantiating it and vetting that information, and then how you then turn around and report it. There's a lot of process that goes through there, and any reputable news organization is going to run it by an attorney. See what you're going to make sure that this person knows what they're doing. So it's all. I mean, you're going to use the information, but there's going to be a process before whatever story you come from there is going to come out.
Okay, we'll take a couple more questions. Jan?
Y'all do a great job on collecting scalpels on your belt and doing the big enterprise stories, but I would like to push you all a little bit to say, how could you do a better job of covering really what are the master narratives that are happening that lead to these big heave stories, but that we don't seem to be doing such a great job of covering now? And certainly the Wall Street meltdown and the foreclosure meltdown are key examples where there were clues all around us, whether it's your neighbor buying a six-figure house that you don't understand how they can afford, or the exotic instruments that were going on, the grotesque executive compensation that was going on. I mean, when do you start pulling the thread earlier, basically?
I just want to correct the record. I mean, I don't want to give people the impression that our paper didn't do these kinds of stories. They did, and they did them wonderfully. I think where we could have improved on is to do more of them. And to recognize it as an area of concentration and to really throw some resources at it. Because we certainly had some very, accurate rifle shots before this happened. What we needed was kind of an army shooting instead of just one or two.
I think it just really goes back to what Mark said so well earlier. I mean, this is a small select group of investigative reporters. Everybody in this room tries very hard to find those threads and pull them every day. Probably everybody here has got a plate load of leads that they haven't had time to explore. The profession as a whole, at large, has never been so big. There's never been more journalists out there, more outlets, and more media, and more of it, I think we would all agree, being what you so aptly call, the lather, covering the handouts, the press releases. There is just a plethora of reporting that's all the same, and it has to do with whatever was put out at 5 p.m. that day. You're going to see it in half an hour later on 100 outlets. So in some respects, part of the answer is to have more people devoted to investigative reporting.
If I could, just one thing that goes back to a point that Mark had made earlier, and that is, even once a story gets reported out and it gets published, it many times doesn't echo in the chamber at all. It just falls flat because we aren't listening. And the best example of that, I guess, is when there was a Knight Ridder Bureau. They wrote about the Iran-Contra affair before the story broke, but nobody heard them. Nobody read. It didn't echo in the chamber. I think now that the web is here, it's a lot better. Josh Marshall can pick up a story from a regional newspaper about a congressman who got involved with a house sale, and then he puts it into the echo chamber in a way that we could never have done before the web. But even once these stories get reported out, edited, and published, sometimes we just aren't really listening to them or reading them.
One more question, anybody? Right here.
Hi, thank you very much. I just have a very simple question, actually. I'm curious if you have an estimate of what percentage of the budget for any particular newspaper or is sort of directed at investigative journalism, and maybe more broadly, if someone has an estimate of how many investigative journalists there are in the country.
I don't think anybody has that, but I'm going to share some interesting little details. I've learned more about the business of journalism in the last 2 years than I ever thought or wanted to. I'm sure Bill Keller would say the same. I'd love to hear a guess from somebody about, in a typical metropolitan newspaper, what percentage of the operating budget is the newsroom, not investigative, the entire news operation in a typical metropolitan newspaper? 15? Other guesses? 25? Yeah, and those are better guesses than I normally get, which is usually 40 or 50. Yeah, but it's between 10 and 15% of the entire operation. Yeah, a lot of it is sports coverage because you go out covering the team, and so there's just no question that in most American newsrooms the investigative endeavor has been brought down because the staffs of typical metro papers is 25, 30, 40, 50% of what it once was. I think, Martin certainly hit on a point that I think for most of us, we see that this is a big part of our value proposition going forward, and we have to preserve it. And fortunately, I'm fortunate enough to work for a newspaper and an owner that understands that, but unfortunately, some do not.
Can I say one thing about that?
Yeah.
And I think this is one of the takeaways that I hope we can discuss further or amongst yourselves going forward about the Bailey Project, is that it put a legacy media organization in partnership with freelance journalists, with philanthropic organizations, with nonprofit journalism organizations like CIR, and academic partners, and really enabled the journalism community as a whole to do something that was special and unique, and that it wasn't about competition. And I think that as we go forward and talk about survival and how we maintain journalistic integrity in society and investigative reporting as costs become a factor, I think journalists, we need to rethink what competition is and what it means, because if we're about serving the community, then maybe that competing news organization in your market should be your partner.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And in fact, we need to think that we're competing. Our competition is the bad guys. It's not each other. And I'll say two things to close that give me some optimism. One is I'm fortunate enough to be on the board of the Center for Investigative Reporting and on the advisory board of ProPublica. And the emergence of these organizations, I think, is the most exciting development in journalism in decades. And I think the opportunity that these and other like organizations offer for journalists who are going to have to be far more entrepreneurial going forward, and their organizations that are going to have to be far more entrepreneurial and creative, I think is a very exciting thing. I also wanted to share personally just our experience, my own personal experience over the past 3 weeks since what really is the tragic closure of the newspaper, in the other newspaper in our city, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. As a journalist, it's heartbreaking to see another newspaper close. That said, it was clear to me, because I learned so much about the business, that our community just couldn't support the cost of 2 newspapers. While this is happening in Seattle and Denver and is being threatened to happen in other communities, I am absolutely certain that we are feeling a ground shift in the public perception of what it is that we do, of investigative journalism in particular, and its importance and its essential nature to the democracy.